When you think of a military vehicle, what pops into your head? A tank, probably. Something big, green and incredibly shouty. Or perhaps a jeep-like thing, bouncing over rough terrain with a grim-faced soldier at the wheel. For the most part, you'd be right. Military hardware is often predictable, built for one job and one job only. To be tough, reliable and generally quite boring. They are the hammers and spanners of a very serious toolbox, but sometimes, just sometimes, the engineers get a bit creative. They throw the rulebook out of the window, have one too many coffees, and decide to build something utterly, brilliantly bonkers. Let's start with something that looks, at first glance, vaguely normal. You take a tracked vehicle chassis, a bit like a small tank without the big turret. A perfectly capable, if unremarkable, piece of Soviet engineering designed to haul things around. It's the military equivalent of a Ford Transit van, useful, ubiquitous, and utterly devoid of anything you might call flair. But then the Soviet engineers got their hands on it. What it needs is more drama and fire and enormous missiles. So they threw away the cargo bay and bolted on a rotating launch platform carrying 3 massive 2 K-12 Cub surface-to-air missiles. The once humble chassis was now a self-contained mobile anti-aircraft system, a moving beast of fire capable of swatting fighter jets out of the sky from miles away. The entire vehicle, now designated the 2P-25, was a symphony of complex engineering. The humble truck chassis had become the heart of a sophisticated and deadly air defense network. Consider the Daimler Ferret, small, nimble, a metal Jack Russell Terrier, designed for reconnaissance, zipping ahead of the main force, typically armed with a single machine gun, just enough for a sticky situation. Cute, in a heavily armored sort of way, but what if you needed your scout car to have a bit more bite? What if it could do more than report? What if it could deal with tanks? Engineers took the tiny Ferret, barely bigger than a family car, and somehow crammed not 1 but 2 enormous anti-tank guided missile launchers onto its turret. These weren't small rockets. They were the French SS.11, chunky wire-guided missiles meant to kill main battle tanks. The radical conversion was nicknamed the Big Wheel Ferret. It looked completely preposterous. A vehicle an enemy might dismiss as a nuisance now could destroy a multi-million-pound tank from over a mile away. It was cheap, fast, could hide behind a reasonably large hedge, yet it carried the sting of a scorpion. This pocket rocket proved you could hunt giants with something small and clever. Tanks do one thing very well. They dominate the land, but they have one major weakness: water. They are, after all, giant metal boxes weighing tens of tons. They sink. So armies spend ages building complicated bridges or searching for shallow crossings. The Soviets, however, had a different idea, a much more ambitious and slightly mad idea. They looked at their T-38 light tank, a small 2-man reconnaissance vehicle from the 1930s, armed only with a machine gun, and decided it should learn to swim. Not just paddle through a shallow ford, but properly swim. And not just swim, but operate as a sort of makeshift submarine. They engineered it to be fully amphibious, drive off a riverbank, chug across the water, climb out the other side, ready to fight. The modifications were ingenious. Hull shaped like a boat, sealed compartments to provide buoyancy, small propeller at the back connected to the tank's engine. A bizarre hybrid, half tank, half boat, entirely unique. T-38 as part of Soviet deep battle doctrine. Little swimming tanks cross rivers ahead of the main force, their ability to appear where the enemy least expected them. Emerging from a lake like some mythical beast, it solved a fundamental military problem, not with brute force, but with clever amphibious engineering. It was, quite simply, a tank that thought it was a duck. Imagine you're fighting a guerrilla war in the vast open bush of Africa. The enemy isn't lining up in neat formations. They are masters of ambush and sabotage, and their favorite weapon is the landmine. They plant them on dirt roads, turning every supply run into a terrifying game of Russian roulette. Their solution looked straight out of a post-apocalyptic movie. They started with the most basic components imaginable: engine, chassis, suspension, from a Volkswagen Combi. Yes, the hippie bus, building a minimalist skeletal frame. The genius was the wheels. Enormous, wide, smooth racing tires, like 1970s Formula One slicks, run at incredibly low pressures to spread weight. The machine looked utterly bizarre, a giant metal spider on racing slicks. This was the Pookie. The wide, low-pressure tires gave ground pressure less than a human foot, so it could drive over most pressure-activated mines. For ones it might trigger, the driver sat in a heavily armoured V-shaped cab, built to deflect the blast outwards. The rest of the vehicle was deliberately flimsy and cheap, so a mine would only blow off replaceable parts. The Pookie was frugal, life-saving innovation, built in local workshops with whatever was available. It was ugly, it was strange, but astonishingly effective. Pookies detected over 550 landmines during the war, and in 76 mine detonations involving the vehicle, no driver was killed. A true Mad Max machine, designed to survive, and it did. Helicopters are the cavalry of the sky. They're fast, agile, perfect for delivering troops, perfect for providing fire support. Traditionally, transport helicopters, basically flying buses, and attack helicopters. Sleek, purpose-built gunships. The two roles were kept separate, unless of course you are a Soviet aircraft designer in the 1960s. The engineers at the Mill Design Bureau thought the split was inefficient. Why send two when one could do both? They weren't designing a transport with a few guns, they were designing a flying infantry fighting vehicle, a flying tank. The result, the Mill Me-24, known in the West as the Hind. And it was a monster. It had a large cabin in the middle, capable of holding 8 soldiers. But bolted onto the outside was an arsenal that would make a battleship blush. Stub wings festooned with rocket pods under the nose. It carried a heavy multi-barreled machine gun, or in later versions, a twin-barreled 30mm cannon. A gun so powerful it was typically found on a ground-based armoured vehicle. It was brutally fast, heavily armoured, and looked utterly terrifying. Doctrine: the Hind would fly to the landing zone, suppress the enemy with its overwhelming firepower, land to drop off its squad of infantry, and then lift off to provide close air support as they fought. It was so heavily armoured it could shrug off small arms fire, earning it the nickname the Flying Tank from the Afghan mujahideen who faced it. It was bold, brutal, and brilliant modification of what a helicopter could be. The Armoured Personnel Carrier, or APC, is the taxi of the battlefield. Think of the classic American M113, it's basically an armoured box on tracks. The soldiers sit in the back, get dropped off. The vehicle either provides a bit of covering fire with its heavy machine gun or drives away to safety. But what if the battle isn't something you drive to? What if the battle is everywhere, all the time? This was the challenge in the long drawn-out South African border war. So, South African engineers created the Ratel, often considered the world's first infantry fighting vehicle. But the command variant was something else entirely. They took the basic Ratel chassis and built a huge raised superstructure on top of it. This wasn't just a command post, it was a mobile town hall for a war zone. Inside this rolling fortress, you had planning tables, advanced long-range radios. They also squeezed in sleeping bunks for the crew, a small kitchen unit, a basic medical clinic. It was an office, a barracks, a hospital, and a formidable fighting vehicle all rolled into one. This mobile city on wheels was revolutionary. It allowed commanders to stay on the move, right at the heart of the action for days or even weeks at a time. They could direct the battle, coordinate air and artillery strikes, manage logistics without ever having to retreat to a static, vulnerable headquarters. The Ratel command vehicle was the nerve center of the whole operation, a self-sufficient fortress that brought command and control directly to the chaos of the front line. And now for something completely different. When you think of Vespa, you think of Rome, sunshine, Audrey Hepburn, and maybe even a nice gelato. You think of nipping through chaotic city traffic with style and a certain cheerful buzz from the two-stroke engine. The Vespa is a symbol of freedom, fun, and carefree Italian living. It is one of the least aggressive vehicles ever made. It's designed for carrying groceries, not for storming a beach, which makes what the French military did to it in the 1950s all the more astonishing. They were looking for a way to drop anti-tank weapons behind enemy lines with their paratroopers, so they looked at the humble Vespa 150 and decided to arm it, not with a rifle rack, no. They mounted a 75mm recoilless rifle directly onto its frame. The Vespa 150 TAP was born. 2 paratroopers would jump out of a plane, one with a parachute for himself, the other with a parachute for the gun scooter. They would land, find their Vespa, and one would drive while the other sat on the back, readying the ammunition. The plan wasn't to fire it while riding. Instead, they'd use the scooter's agility to reach a firing position, dismount the gun onto its tripod, and engage the target. The recoilless rifle, essentially a small cannon, could penetrate the armor of most tanks of the era. This 2-wheeled tank buster was minimalist military design. It was cheap, it was light enough to be airdropped. It gave a 2-man team firepower, usually reserved for larger units. The ultimate hit-and-run weapon, a tiny David versus a Goliath. The Vespa 150 TAP, the Bazooka Vespa, saw service in Algeria, Indochina, proving even unlikely vehicles can be transformed into weapons. It stands as perhaps the wildest, most unexpected vehicle modification of all time. So there you have it, a journey through the looking glass of military engineering. From a Soviet truck that grew missiles to a charming Italian scooter that became a tank killer, these vehicles are a powerful reminder that the path of innovation is rarely a straight one. For every 100 standard issue by-the-book designs, there is one glorious oddity that throws convention to the wind. These machines were born from desperation, from necessity, and from the wild sparks of imagination that refuse to be constrained by what is considered sensible. They are the mavericks, the rule breakers, the glorious mechanical misfits. Some, like the SA-6 Gainful and the Ratel, were resounding successes that changed the way battles were fought. They identified a problem and solved it with a blend of audacity and clever engineering, creating new categories of vehicles that others would rush to copy. They proved that taking a risk, modifying a humble chassis into something it was never meant to be, could pay off spectacularly. These successes litter the history books, standing as monuments to the power of thinking differently, of seeing a truck and imagining a dragon. Others, let's be honest, were magnificent follies, brilliant ideas that were perhaps a bit too ambitious, too strange, or too niche to ever see widespread use. But failure in this context is not the opposite of success. It's a vital part of the process. Every strange prototype, every failed experiment teaches a lesson. The road to the perfect weapon is littered with glorious, fascinating wrecks. Ultimately, these 7 machines tell a story not just about war, but about human creativity under pressure. They show that even in the most serious of enterprises, there is room for flair, for madness, and for a touch of genius. They challenge our assumptions and remind us that the next great invention might not come from a clean-sheet design, but from a mechanic in a dusty workshop looking at a scooter and a cannon and thinking, you know what, I reckon I can make that work. For better or for worse, it is this unstoppable, imaginative and gloriously mad spirit of invention that drives us forward. And for that, we should all be profoundly grateful. And honestly, a little bit scared. Subscribe to Top Gun and like the video.